Hello, everyone. I'm Brian Neaston, author of the autobiography of a Werewolf Hunter series, and this is Whiskey with the Werewolf Hunter. Welcome back to the Werewolf Bar and our show's fourth season, which actually started last month, but I've still got people wishing me Happy New Year, so I guess it doesn't matter. We're going to get things started the way we always do every month here on Whiskey with the Werewolf Hunter with our creature of the night. But before we get to the whiskey, someone recently asked me if there was a special reason why we call it the creature of the night. Was it just a general nod to monsters? Was I comparing whiskey to a monster? You know, what's the deal? And it was a good question. And the answer is that the notion of referring to whiskey as the creature or a creature comes from the Irish usage of an Old English word called craithur, which means creature, as applied to comforting things like hot food, strong drink, which is actually the origin of the modern term creature comforts. It also finds inspiration in the Bible, the book of 1 Timothy, as in every creature of God is good. And so referring to whiskey as the creature is a term of endearment as much as it is an appropriate title for this part of the show. But like I said, it was a great question. And with that said, tonight's creature is a single barrel batch of Clark and Sheffield's Kentucky Straight Bourbon. Now, this stuff is distilled, aged, and bottled in Kentucky, but the Clark and Sheffield brand is actually owned by Benny's Beverage Depot, who got their start in 1948 in Chicago on the corner of Clark and Sheffield streets. They make various types of other spirits as well, wine too. But their bourbon is hard to beat for the money, and in fact has become one of my go-to whiskeys here at the Werewolf Bar. So we're going to have a little of a single batch Clark and Sheffield tonight. This particular bottle was gifted to me by my father-in-law for Christmas, and he was born and raised in the city of Chicago. So here's to you, Rich, and then to you as well. Cheers. So it's got a pepper meets fruit, kind of a nose to it, sweeter palate of vanilla notes, offset by a kind of a buildup of clove and cinnamon there in the finish. Definitely worth your while if you're in the Midwest with the Benny's nearby. Well, it's been almost a year since we've had Dr. T. Broussard here with us, and he's had his hands full putting together a couple of new books that he's been working on. Last year, I approached Dr. Broussard about producing a segment for the show that would sort of break down the primary occult influences of my book series. And he said he wanted to, but he just couldn't get to it right away. He had other projects he needed to wrap up. Well, I've got some good news and some bad news for you. The good news I'm pleased to announce is that starting next month, Whiskey with the Werewolf Hunter will be bringing you Dr. Broussard, and he's going to be presenting us with that new series. So as you can see, it's called Doc Talk Shop, an occult primer to the autobiography of a Werewolf Hunter series. It'll be covering things like topics of shape changers, disembodied spirits, cultural, magical traditions, and a lot more. I'm looking forward to it, and it's coming your way next month in March. Another bad news, due to some personal scheduling issues, next month's episode is likely going to be a few days past our target date of the 15th. But not to worry, We'll have that episode up and ready just as soon as we possibly can. Well, tonight we're going to finish my narration of Spirits in the Silence. I'm making this the end of a 4-part series. But before we get back into Sly's adventures in the small ski town of Skawak, British Columbia, I have to share with you something I put together a couple of weeks ago just for the fun of it. Maybe you know this, maybe you don't. But one of my TV heroes is Rod Serling. He's most famous, of course, for The Twilight Zone, and that's certainly the lion's share of his legacy. But he also did 3 seasons of a television show back in the early 70s called Night Gallery, and which is where I was first actually introduced to the man. And for those of you who don't know, Night Gallery was an anthology horror series on NBC where Rod acted as host and curator of an art gallery with paintings more geared toward the supernatural and dark fantasy than science fiction, as was the case in The Twilight Zone. And for every painting, there was a story making up the anthology. Whether it's The Twilight Zone or The Night Gallery, I love Rod Serling's introductions. The way he spoke, the language that he used in those monologues just resonated with me then, and it still resonates with me now. So as an interesting editorial project, I decided to see what would happen if Mr. Serling presented a certain painting featuring a certain character in his Night Gallery. I apologize for the sound quality of this in advance, and you're going to want to turn up your speakers a little bit for this one, but go ahead and take a look.
Good evening. We offer you an evening sojourn amongst the wild, the woolly, the hunter and the hunted. That rare breed of Homo sapien whose love of butchery is not a sport but a consuming passion. Example, this item here. It's called Hatred Unto Death, and it makes comment on the fact that there are certain psychologists who hold the conviction that blood memories are passed along in the genes. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the Night Gallery.
Now, I actually looked into having a Rod Serling voice actor perform an original monologue for that sequence, but there aren't that many convincing Rod Serling impersonators out there, and the few that I found were simply cost prohibitive for a little vanity segment like that. Anyway, let's continue now with the conclusion of Spirits in the Silence.
Spirits in the Silence from Dark Rivers Run, an unpublished manuscript of autobiography of a werewolf hunter. 3 maglite beams probed through the night and the rain as we marched abreast down the muddy trail. Finally, one of our beacons struck the bleak whiteness of a headstone, and almost instantly dozens of others became apparent, most of them striped with layers of wet weeds and grass that glistened like slugs' trails. Biggs stopped first and swept the cemetery with his light. "Fuller's Ridge," he announced. The stones were arranged haphazardly, and many were wilted to one side or broken. I thought of where Samantha and Joshua were buried back in Washington State, and it was nothing like this place. Fuller's Ridge was the kind of place that children would go out of their way to avoid after sunset. I'd been in eerier places, but I had to admit it was macabre even for a boneyard. "Where's he buried?" I nearly shouted through the flood of rain. The sheriff led the way through the marble, stone, and decrepit wooden markers. He was cautious where he stepped. White Crow, too. He respected this silent city of the dead, but to me, dead men were dead men. They weren't so special. There wasn't anyone here I'd respected or even known in life, so why bother watching my step now that they're dead? Anyway, I had graver, pardon the pun, things to be watchful for. After a while, Biggs announced our arrival. "Here he is," he said soberly. We gathered around the simple obligatory metal marker with the name Samuel Eldwin Vargo and the dates 1917 to 1990, spelled out in raised type. The mound where his pauper's casket lay was still very fresh and soft. "Not much, is it?" John remarked. The rain was relentless, but I wasn't done, not by a damn sight. "You say Sam had this place picked out?" I asked Biggs. "Yeah, bought it years ago. he said over the torrent. I crouched at the stone to the right and brushed the wet grass from its face. Faintly, almost illegibly scratched on the pale white marker was the name I was looking for. Clara Birchtree, died 1942. You want to see why he bought it years ago? I asked him. They stooped beside me and wiped the rain from their eyes. The answer stood there in the raging torrent around us. You don't think, started John, that Sam was the man she ran off with? I interjected. What do you think? He took their mother from them, Biggs declared. Mother, stepmother. Slave, I added. Samuel must have told me the story of Clara running off a half-dozen times, and it was him all along. I felt something besides the wind and rain, besides the chill of night. From our rear, through the wash, something was moving. Biggs and White Crow responded immediately to my wordless alarm, and the three of us raised our weapons simultaneously. I could see a lithe shadow, splotched with rain, nimbly working its way toward us. The movement was feminine, and I recognized the gait. Nobody fires unless I do, I ordered. I think it's Jesse Lucas, John realized. I'm not armed, came the disembodied voice. We should kill her now, growled Biggs. In his mind, we'd declare war on every last Lucas around. The years of cowering from them had taken its toll. All I wanted was the wolf. Damn it, Biggs, don't you shoot, I warned. I let her come as close as I dared, and she stopped before I had to tell her to. She was breathless. Her hair plastered against her face, and her clothes clung to every curve of her body. Her feet and shins were caked with red and mud almost to her thighs. She'd come a long way on foot. I took the .45 from her, and John relaxed the Winchester a little, but Biggs was vigilant with the 10-gauge. You got to get out of here, mister, she panted. She spoke to me like I was the only one standing there. Barnabas, he's coming to kill you, all three of you. She was nearly exhausted, and I took her by the shoulders to help her hold her up. He's coming here? I asked her. She nodded passionately, a waterfall tumbling down her face. He followed you from Black Elm Hollow. He's hunting you, and he ain't afraid of your silver bullets. He don't care if he dies along with you. My blood froze when I felt the steel press against my shirt. Take it, she gasped. She held my lost Colt flat against my stomach. Take it, she repeated. I took it from her as I searched her eyes again. They were as beautiful as they were hard, but they were good, and mirrors of fear. You stay with us. She pulled away from me, shaking her head. Cain's kill me if he finds out I've been talking to you. You killed Saul. She turned and broke into a sprint for the nearest stretch of woods. I almost ran after her. Jesse, wait! I yelled, but she was already gone, vanished into the night like a will-o-wisp. A howl mourned on the wind in her wake. It blended with the grisly splatter of raindrops on tombstones, and it was without a doubt the voice of a wolf. Biggs and John heard it too and poised their weapons to the cry. Heads up, boys, this is it. We've got a beastie in the perimeter. Just like I'd instructed the day before, we went back to back to form a human triangle. I quickly checked the clip of my returned .45 and clicked one up the pipe, then stood defiant with one in each hand. Words from Marine boot camp came to mind. I am a minister of death, praying for war. I stood solid and wary, channeling all my sensory power that I could spare into my ears. At my right, Deputy John Whitecrow leveled the .30-30 and kept its barrel pacing the void in front of him like a vengeful sentinel. To my left, Sheriff Biggs held Saunders' Siamese barrels from the hip. His skin was cold with fear, but for some men, they need that fear to feed the fire. The arcane cry of the wolf fell across the trees again, closer than before, but unpredictable in any direction. The Gemini bores of Biggs' scattergun bellowed and belched out tongues of flame, one after the other. The blast nearly deafened us. John and I turned to fire as well, but there was nothing to shoot at, just Biggs holding a smoldering sounder. I saw something! I swear I did! He cried. Where, goddammit? I barked through my teeth. He pointed, but we could see nothing but the rain. Fumbling with the breech, he tried to reload, but his hands trembled badly and his breath came short and sporadic. I knew he'd all but lost it. I turned back to my angle. Get a hold of yourself, Sheriff! If you want to live through tonight, you cannot lose your head. You only get one shot at this." I didn't see it coming. It knew Biggs was empty, and taking advantage of his floundering attempt to reload, stole closer to our three-man fortress. Biggs screamed, and God, it must have been 3 feet away when it lunged. Like hell from on high, it descended on him, seizing his throat in a gruesome fist and smashing him to the ground like a rag doll. John and I rolled from the close impact, scattering from its range as the beast pulled back its free claw to deal the death blow. White Crow recovered his bearings and pulled the shot off at its back. It shrieked from the crashing hollow point that blasted it away from the sheriff. Rolling with the brunt of it, it squealed and gathered itself into black haunches. It had the eyes of a lunatic. It knew he had silver, felt it all too acutely. But he was neither intimidated nor impressed. Not afraid to die, Jesse had warned. Afraid or not, it was on its way. It was almost majestic the way it lurched into the rain-streaked air, faster than either of us could lock and fire, more graceful, more deadly than any 10 jungle cats. Its teeth were a filmy yellowish red, its eyes stark mad, and its talons hooked like small swords. A fraction of a second was the span between life and death. But despite all its grotesque splendor, 3 muzzles, fat with killing silver, were already waiting with their own brand of majesty, and spoke with ultimate authority. 4 .45 wad cutters burst into its heart and lungs, expanding to appropriate size, while 2 rounds from the 94 dealt devastation to its head and spine. Inches before us, it flattened with a thudding, bloody gurgle. Its ebony fur was slick crimson, velvet with pink chiclets of flesh freckled around the gapes. Sounder stood barrel first in a quagmire, Biggs motionless beside it. White Crow gawked, dumbfounded at the riddled monstrosity at his feet, as I rushed to the sheriff's side. He was still breathing, but hurt badly. Blood bubbled from his mouth. Punctures dotted his neck where Barnabas's claws had pierced, but he didn't appear to have been bitten. "Still with us, John?" I shouted over the endless downpour. As though he'd just woke from a nightmare, he slid into the standing water beside me. "Biggs," he spoke. "He's alive, but I don't know for how much longer. We've got to get him out of here." Together, we scooped him from the mud and started for the truck. The tiny entrance trail was a surging creek as we hauled him through the ankle-deep mire. Half blinded and nearly drowned, the Chevy looked like heaven, and we hoisted the big sheriff into the cab. Under different circumstances, there'd been no way I'd dared that road, given the shape it was in. But my best guess was that Biggs was busted up on the inside, and his life was in our hands. John cradled him on his lap, and I kept talking to him. I was telling him he was going to be all right. My full-time job was keeping all 4 wheels on the road, and out of any of the killer gullies this place had plenty of. "What do you think?" John shivered. We were both chilled. "Do I look like a doctor? I don't think he was nipped. That's the main thing. Now don't talk to me," I snapped. I could do nothing but focus every nerve on keeping us topside. I dared not blink. The trip back down had one thing in our favor: gravity. If it hadn't been a downhill run, the Silverado wouldn't have made it a mile through the gumbo beneath us. The problem was slowing down around the curves without spinning us into the sweet by and by. I wouldn't have been as tense about the whole thing if I just could have seen 6 inches in front of me. It must have been well past 11 when we arrived in Wells. Skawak really should lose a few bucks and get a hospital of their own, I thought to myself. John and I waited like drowned rats in the lobby of Wells Memorial while Biggs underwent emergency surgery. Apparently some of his vertebrae had been twisted on impact and were pressing against his spinal cord. There was a small puncture in one lung and from some broken ribs. Blood had collected in his brain. The prognosis was dim, but as much as we wanted to, we knew we couldn't stay. There was no law back in Skawak, and after the events of the evening we both knew there had to be. The street lights seemed duller than I remembered when we returned, but at least the rain had begun to taper off. Every drainage ditch was backed up into the streets, and the scent of death rode on the breeze. It had become a familiar smell recently. The truck parted waves in the flooded streets as a peculiar feeling came over me. "Something's up," I muttered to John. "I smell it too," he confirmed. I pulled into the sheriff's station and turned off the lights. "Watch yourself," I warned. He clung to the Winchester, and I poked one Colt into my pants for easy access. He turned the key in the door and pushed it open. A shotgun barrel flushed against his forehead from the shadows as an unfamiliar voice welcomed us inside. "Come on in, boys. Glad you could make it." One twitch, Wolf Hunter, and the engine loses his mind. I didn't twitch. Lights flashed on inside the office and revealed a room full of Lucases. Damien brandished the shotgun against John's head, his dishwater blonde hair clinging limply to his shoulders. His eyes were glassy and wild, but as I suspected, there was no beast. Jessie sat cowed on the sofa, still muddy to her hips and freshly beaten. Her long hair was dirty, and it fell over her bloodied face as she hung her head. But the man of the hour sat shirtless behind Big's desk, in half-wolf form. Kane's skin was noticeably grazed with a downy-like fleece, all except a patch around the angry red wound just under his clavicle. The start of fangs smiled in his mouth, and his eyes were reddened with blood. His voice was as guttural as his appearance, and a stainless Colt python sat before him on the desktop. "Where's the fat boy?" he growled. John's lean face scowled back at him, but Damien pressed the pump gun harder. "He asked you a question," he squawked. "Your freak of a brother killed him," I answered for John. Damien's face lit up with an evil smirk, and it spread into a cancerous smile over his gnarled face, but Kane wasn't grinning. "You hear that? Barnabas got that fucker," Damien gloated. Kane rose abruptly and stepped around the desk with his python. "Shut up, idiot!" he hissed at his baby half-brother. Kane and I exchanged a seething stare. He knew. The only reason we were still alive was because Barnabas was dead. The kid, on the other hand, wasn't as bright, but Kane had been around a long, long time. He shook his animal-like head as he stopped between the desk and the couch where Jessie was huddled. "Jezebel told me about your silver bullets, but I didn't believe it until last night. I've heard of you, you know. Silvo, right?" he asked with a rasp. "I guess I've got a reputation with your breed," I said smugly. His inhuman eyes searched me and found my returned .45 without looking. He snatched Jessie by her hair, ripped her to her feet, and drew her across the desk. He seized her throat with a half-claw and spewed a mist of rancid spittle as he roared into her face. "Bitch! You warned them, didn't you?" She cringed helplessly from his wrath as he racked her farther across the desk. She was frozen with terror. "I took the weapon from her. I was going to kill her, but she ran too fast. The little bitch tried to kill me." I tried to defend her. I wasn't completely lying, of course. She did take a shot at me with a buffalo rifle. That counts. But he kept her pinned, turned to me. He was becoming more bestial by the minute. Damien kept vigilant with the shotgun, and White Crow kept quiet. "That's 2 of my brothers you've killed," he snarled. "No more." He glared sadistically back into Jessie's battered face. "You're worthless, and I'll deal with you later." And he threatened her, barely coherent fury. He snapped her off her back and flung her aside. She fell into a coffee stand and collapsed onto the floor. "You son of a bitch," John finally mumbled. Damien forced John's head back with the force of the steel bore. Kane glowered at us. "If the engine says another word, blow his goddamn head off," he ordered. Damien's eyes reflected indifference to the task. Everything was about to go to shit, and my mind raced through my limited options for the most appropriate move to make. "You've got your gun back," Kane rumbled. "Now I want mine." "That ancient piece of shit? It's in the safe behind the picture. Be my guest," I taunted. The weapon wasn't going to make or break the situation, but I was banking on the distraction to buy time. Kane strode to the cheap painting of a ship at sea, knocked it off the wall, and exposed the metal door of the safe behind it. He ran his lengthened fingers across the face and then slowly shanked his talons deep into the steel. The power of the beast never ceases to baffle me. With a gesture, he buckled the door and twisted it off like cardboard. He discarded the .357 Python and clutched the relic in a hirsute fist. "This is my favorite pistol in the world," he croaked. "I took it from a Mountie somewhere around the turn of the century. He'd carried it proudly right up until the day I ate his heart out. Bullets kill a man fast, but not as fun as the old-fashioned way." He tossed the firearm onto the sofa. Kane Lucas had been a werewolf for more years than I knew, and he knew how to manipulate his power and transformation. But toying with us was sorely underestimating me. I was almost certain I could have taken out Kane and Damien at any time, but I wanted John to live through the night with me. It was funny, but I'd never tried to save the life of a woman who'd tried to kill me before. But I wanted Jessie to make it too. I must be getting soft, I thought. "So you're just going to kill us?" I felt stupid asking. "It looks to me like both of you are still armed. Save yourselves. Besides, I have other plans for you," he growled. "People always tell me I'm special," I mocked. He had the phases of metamorphosis down to a science, and slowly proceeded, his Carhartt shredded to rags as he held his hand claws in front of him as they began to spread into razors. "First, I'm going to rake across your hide until you beg me to stop. Then, bite by bite, I'm going to eat you alive. Then I'll lick up your blood from my hands and off my muzzle and toss what I don't eat to my pigs." Every word of it spoke summoned with the venom within me. They were like salt in an open wound. The frothing arrogance, its unmitigated and feeble attempt to intimidate me, knotted my stomach to nausea and turned my blood to molten plasma. I have seldom wanted to kill a wolf so badly. The taste of hate began to thicken on my tongue, boiling to a fever in my gut. From the darkness of my soul, an inferno threatened to plunge me into madness. As sure as he was becoming what he truly was, so was I. A moment flashed. I was content to die with this slavering fiend and be done with it all. It was a hair's breadth from ripping both colts in bloody abandon and feeding my vengeance. But at the corner of my eye stood John. I'd done my best to see us through, but I couldn't take much more, and I think Kane knew it. It could smell my rage like a festering boil as the chain neared its climax. "You will suffer the torments of the damned," he thundered in a voice that was neither man nor beast. "How does that sound?" "Like you've got a long night ahead of you," I said. Glass broke, and the metal coffee caddy toppled as Jessie rose from her own blood. Damien had been taught well. He never flinched from John's face. There wasn't an easy way to do this, but time was up. "Jessie, no!" I shouted in diversion. Both Kane and Damien turned to watch their backs, and in that heartbeat, I struck the pump gun's barrel away from John's forehead. It discharged into the ceiling and in a hail of plaster. John raised his rifle into Damien's chest and buried a .30-30 round between his chest. The boy flew backwards with his heart and lungs exiting through his spine and melted into an ashen heap against the red-blanketed wall. Kane railed for John with all the force and speed of a demon, and I don't even remember drawing my Colts. In a haze of brown, Kane's nails peeled into John's back. The blow rocked him off his feet and into the wall, unconscious, as the Winchester went sliding across the room. I saw tatters of Kevlar draped from Kane's claws, but no blood. Both Colts stared straight into his face, and I pressed one bore against each of his eyes. Unlike his crazy brother Barnabas, Kane was afraid to die. I should have just plugged it, but all the temptation in the world, this one I find hardest to resist, is humiliating a wolf before he dies, just like they do. "Now what were you going to do to me, Sparky? Tell me again, I forget," I foolishly taunted him. Its rabid maw was agape in horror at the hollow black barrels that reserved its death, the silver just inches from its brain. More rapidly than it had begun, its transformation slipped into his naked human guise. Dirty bastard. Been alive over 100 years, huh? Killed how many people, not counting women and children? Well, it all ends tonight, motherfucker. Say hello to the devil for me. I spat in his face. Then my eyes were drawn to the rawhide strip around his neck and the arrowhead that hung from it. I knew that necklace, that black obsidian arrowhead. Where'd you get that choker? I demanded. Off a dead man, came the reply. The man who'd cared for me, maybe saved my life. I twisted the barrels into his eyes harder. What dead man? I fumed. He managed to smile at my frustration. I almost wasted him without another thought. You know him, don't you? He asked coldly. Samuel? The implications of his answer fell like a millstone into my mind. Lying cocksucker. It's true. I bit his throat out and took his most prized possession. That can't be, I cooled. In an instant of confusion, his arms lifted and divided mine. The sheer force of effort pulled both Colts from my grip and set off 2 worthless rounds into the walls. I'd never seen a wolf transform so quickly. In a brutal snap of cartilage and bone, he was full-blown beast. He slashed for my throat, but I'd anticipated it and began a dodge a split second before it came. I felt the breeze. His voice had faded to muddled gravel, but I think it said, "You're dead." Of my own volition, I tumbled backwards to put some distance between us. The desk now stood between us, but it slipped into a far wall with such drive that it burst through. Cool, wet night air flooded the office as it stalked its foolishly defenseless prey. Thin icicles of saliva clunked between jagged fangs, and its ears tucked against its head. It was ready for the kill. No more gaming. It had become more personal with me than it had been with Sam. I looked up into its twisted features. "Give it your best shot," I defied as I stood. The room was bathed in an echo as a crater opened in Kane's chest. The 30-30 round punched through, spraying me with scarlet and gray hunks of bone carried into my vest. The carry-through knocked me to my back. Kane stood paralyzed. Its vital organs littered the floor and my shoes. Black eyes glistened wet before its lupine knees buckled and dwindled to a reddish-brown mound. Across the room, on the other end of a curl of gun smoke, stood a bruised and bleeding Jesse Lucas. The rifle fell from her hands as she sank back to the floor. I lay down with a sigh of relief and fought to catch my wind. It was September 5th. John and I stood over Big's hospital bed. It would be a while before he could fulfill his duties as sheriff, but the worst was over. Jesse waited at the door like a silent shadow. John had a bruised rib or two, and all I got out of the deal was a big purple asterisk on my chest and an obsidian arrowhead for a souvenir. The Mounties had sent some people to Squawk to clean up, and in typical government fashion, swept the whole mess under the rug as classified, more likely than not to end up in the files of covert operations. Nobody ever told me what they do with the werewolf carcasses I leave behind. Biggs spoke slowly, but clearly. "Did you give it to him?" he said, just above a whisper to John. "I almost forgot." John reached into the lining of his jacket and produced a thick white envelope. "Merry Christmas," he offered. I took the pouch and peeked inside. It was fat with $100 bills. "What's this for?" I asked. "We found Samuel's stash when we were at the cabin looking for you," he said slyly. "Where? I looked." "You didn't look inside the stove. There's around $8,000 there. You haven't really earned it, but..." I leafed through the bills. "You guys have been holding out on me, eh?" "Put it in your pocket and shut up," Biggs demanded weakly. I smiled and handed John 5 of the bills. "See to it that Samuel gets a decent headstone, okay?" He took the money between his fingers. "You bet," he promised. I'm not going to get all misty or anything, but you guys really came through for me. I don't get to say that very often, so thanks. What are you going to do with her? John asked me. She wants to come with me. There's nothing for her here. I guess I could use the company. I'd sleep lightly if I were you, John remarked. I don't know, I said. She's got pluck. Damn near closed you down, Big said. Where will you go now? John asked me. South, probably, into the States. Maybe Vegas? Las Vegas? John puzzled. That doesn't sound like your style. Put a pool cue in my hand and you'd be surprised what my style is, I said with a hand on his shoulder. He's going on vacation, Biggs wheezed. Puts in a lousy week of work and takes a holiday. In case you were wondering, I hear the Squawk Sheriff's Department has an opening or two. You'd be welcome, John offered. I'll keep the offer in mind if I'm ever back this way. I've had about all the peacekeeping I can stand for now. Which reminds me, I fumbled through my jacket and took out DuPont's old star. Merry Christmas right back to you. And I put it in John's hand. Biggs held out a broad hand from the bed and I took it. Good luck to you, Logan. You too, Sheriff. I turned to White Crow. John, as I shook his hand, thanks for saving my life, by the way. And I'll let you save mine sometime. I pocketed the envelope as the nurse walked in, none other than the Gestapo. Nurse Ratchet, I greeted. Oh, not you again, she muttered as she walked to the bedside. Don't worry, I was just leaving. Jessie clung to my arm like a lost kid, and we walked through the halls. I realized that she needed me and that she had no one else in the world. Sounded familiar. I had no idea how long this relationship might last, but for that time I was content to be with her. Have I mentioned that she was a knockout? As we climbed into the truck, I wrapped the black arrowhead in Sam's weather-beaten letter and placed it in the glove box. I hadn't figured the whole thing out yet, but I knew there were more things afoot in my life that I didn't understand. I smiled at Jessie into the fading bruises and cuts on her face, and she smiled back. You sure you want this? I asked. She nodded. I saved your life, she said. That means it's mine. At least I hope she was teasing. I felt like I owed something more than a headstone to Samuel Vargo, but it was the best I could do for now. The end.
Well, I hope you were able to follow that all okay, and that the unedited content wasn't too hard to listen to. If you want to hear more, let me know in the comments down below, because I've got lots of content to share with you, unpublished stories and manuscripts that we could go through. The next story on that list, should we decide to continue, is called Sacrifices of Blood and follows Sylvester as a lone hitchhiker picked up by a traveling defrocked minister. And it gets interesting from there. So that's going to wrap it up for me here tonight. You can find me on the web at www.werewolfhunter.com. You can drop me a line at brian@werewolfhunter.com. Thanks for liking and subscribing, and of course for being with us for a little while this evening. We'll see you next time here at the Werewolf Bar. But until then, happy hunting and mind the moon.